Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to our recording here. As with our other topic for Season of Creation, I am creating a companion recording to go with the conversation that we had after church. This particular one was September 29th, 2024, the last Sunday of creation season. So, our topic that day was a little bit of a slideshow of what had occurred here in Dallas-Fort Worth on April the 8th, 2024, which was a total eclipse. So we wanted to chat a bit about that. This recording is going to add to that. We had a very cursory discussion about the technical aspects of eclipse, the geometry, why they occur, background of it. We mainly spent our time actually looking at eclipse photographs. So I think a lot of people probably understand this, that after, having paid attention back in April, and one of the things that is a little bit difficult to grasp in these types of photographs are the fact that nothing can really be to scale. If we drew the Earth and the Moon and the Sun at the correct distances and the correct sizes, they would just be tiny dots on the screen and nobody could figure out what was going on. And this is true whether you go to NASA's website or space.com, another wonderful resource. You'll tend to find that this is true, that all of the photographs and depictions like this one here can't really be to scale because it just is impossible to do on the scope of a page or a screen, the kinds of ways that we tend to consume our information. So the reason we have an eclipse is that the sun is about 400 times larger than the moon, and the moon is about 400 times closer than the sun. So from our perspective, standing on the surface of Earth, looking at the sun at the moment that all this aligns, and we'll talk about why that's fairly rare, as that occurs, the two superimpose each other, or in this case, the moon superimposes the sun almost completely. And we'll get to the details of that in a second. So when this occurs, just as a quick terminology here, the space where everything is completely a total eclipse is referred to as the umbral shadow. So that particular shadow is completely covered in terms of the moon covering up the sun. So the other shadow here is the penumbral shadow. A note to anyone that wants to do this for a living, make sure you feed your cats before you get into making a recording here. So the penumbral shadow is what you see actually outside of that. So if you put it on a map, the point where you'll experience what is referred to as totality is in the umbra shadow. And in this case, the penumbra is considered to be the area outside of that. The penumbral shadow is considered out of that, and you see a partial eclipse. So any eclipse will be seen over a wide swath, but only a select area can you see the total eclipse. So it doesn't really have to be this way, as it turns out. The distances, the sizes, everything that we see is kind of a coincidence. There's no laws of physics or laws of astronomy or laws of gravity or anything that creates the condition of an eclipse for it to be this way. Millions of years ago, the moon was actually closer to the Earth. Much closer might be an exaggeration, but it was closer. It is in a continuous pattern of moving away from the Earth, but at kind of in the measurement of centimeters. So it's not something that you would ever notice in your lifetime. But over millions of years, it does actually accumulate. And millions of years ago, the moon actually eclipsed the sun to a much greater degree than what it does today. And in fact, even today, it's not a complete eclipse. And so we'll kind of examine cases where that exists. So a quick another set of terms here in case you get into an eclipse conversation with somebody in the future. If you take the eternal sun, obviously that's not what we're looking at when we look up at the sun. What we actually see is something referred to as the photosphere. So this is what you have to wear the eclipse glasses or use filters or have anything that is set up to actually observe the sun has to account for the photosphere, which is the dominant degree of energy that comes to the Earth. Just outside of that is something called the chromosphere, and that is visible. In fact, we'll see evidence of it in the photographs a bit later in this presentation. So that is outside of the moon during a total eclipse. You can see what is in the chromosphere. And then outside of that is what is referred to as the corona. So as the moon covers the sun, the photosphere is completely obscured. You cannot see anything in regards to the photosphere, which is the reason why in the actual moments of the total eclipse you can take your eclipse glasses off safely and observe the eclipse. This cannot take place in a partial eclipse. You have to leave your glasses on the entire time. Any time that the photosphere is exposed at all, you have to account for that. So why are eclipses so infrequent? There is a path where the Earth revolves around the sun in a given year's time frame, and that particular plane that the Earth revolves around the sun is referred to when discussing this topic as the ecliptic plane. Now, as it turns out, the moon also has a plane as it rotates around the Earth, but the two don't perfectly align. In this case, the moon's orbit is tilted about 5 degrees. That may not sound like very much, but if everything was shown here in true scale, you would realize that as a result, the vast majority of the time, the moon can't be between the Earth and the sun. And so that's why the vast majority of the time period in any given moment of the year, you don't have an opportunity for an eclipse. So if you look on this kind of sideways here, this is not quite to scale either, but it's a little bit closer. Kind of shows that tilt and shows that, of course, the moon is actually casting a shadow from the sun at all times. It's just that that shadow doesn't appear anywhere on the surface of the Earth, so we don't see it. If you were out in space, you could observe it, but we don't see it here. So as the two planes intersect, and given that we're talking about two planes that revolve, one in the case of the Earth around the sun and the other in the moon around the Earth, the two planes are constantly intersecting, and at the point that they do, they refer to that as a node. So as the moon goes below this ecliptic plane, it's called a descending node, and as it goes above, it's an ascending node. And what this does is it creates a period where twice a year, this particular tilt of the moon is such that these intersecting points are exactly in between the Earth and the sun. This is when you can have an eclipse. It's only during these two time periods. So an eclipse season, as they refer to it, is about 30 days, a little bit longer. And this is a little longer than the amount of time it takes the moon to go around the Earth. So what this means is that there will always be a solar eclipse every 6 months. Now, it's not necessarily a total eclipse, and it may only be happening in a obscure, maybe up around one of the poles or something to that effect. So it may not be something that's very visible to people, and that's why we consider it to be infrequent. But in reality, some kind of eclipse is relatively happening somewhere every 6 months. Now, another component that makes this a little bit more complex is that the moon's distance from the Earth is not constant. It's a little bit of an oval, and the Earth is not dead center. Now, I've exaggerated it in this diagram just for effect, so you can appreciate that there's a little bit closer and more distant appearance for the moon. But this is true, that there are points where the moon is at a far distance. This is referred to as apogee, and then it gets closer, and this is referred to as perigee at the moment where the moon is as close as it gets to the Earth. So the impact of this is that when you're standing on the surface of the Earth looking at the moon, it appears larger at perigee, about 12% larger. So in this case, when an eclipse occurs when the moon is at perigee, you get a total eclipse. So that's another factor of why this is as infrequent as it is that you don't just simply have everything align, you have to align it at a point where the moon is very close to the Earth in order to see this case. So if you take the case here on the right of perigee, the moon completely covers the photosphere of the sun. This is what happened on April the 8th. Perigee was actually about 7 hours prior to the moment that the eclipse occurred in Dallas-Fort Worth. So it was very close to absolute perigee, and that's why it was a total eclipse. About 6 months earlier, another eclipse occurred. This one actually came through Texas as well, but the moon was at one of its smaller phases. It was a lot closer to apogee, and as a result, it did not completely cover the photosphere of the sun. So there was never a moment in observing that eclipse where you could take your eclipse glasses off. Even though it has a very dramatic name called the Ring of Fire, you had to have a filter on the entire time. So it didn't look anything like a total eclipse. An annular eclipse is not necessarily super special to observe, as it turns out. Now, a partial eclipse, and these actually occur quite a bit more frequently than either of the two prior cases, is really just simply when the moon is passing in front of the sun, but either due to the timing or due to your location on the Earth or whatever, you don't get complete coverage. So in this case as well, you have to have your eclipse glasses on in order to observe something like this. You can see a little space cut out of the sun when you do that, but if you don't have your eclipse glasses on, then obviously you can't look at the sun. It is still way too bright. So these are two sequences of photographs. The top one was taken by me on April the 8th, 2024. It shows the moon kind of beginning the eclipse in the upper left, and you can see the moon covering more and more of the sun, eventually resulting in a totality view where you can actually view, in this case, prominently in that photograph, is the sun's corona. The other sequence was also taken by me on October the 14th, 2023 in Odessa, Texas. And in this case, the moon was much closer to apogee, meaning it was farther from the Earth. So at the point where the moon completely eclipsed the sun as best that it could that day, there was still a ring around the moon of the photosphere. So that photo taken on the far right of the bottom sequence is still taken through a filter. So you can't actually, we weren't able to see it with the naked eye. We were still only observing that particular eclipse either through eclipse glasses or through filters. So as it turns out, these two eclipse seasons both came through Texas. The earlier one, the annular eclipse that occurred in October of 23, started in looks like Oregon and made its way down through Texas, eventually going out into the Gulf of Mexico over Corpus Christi. And then the total eclipse, much more famous because of that, the fact that it was total, Started down off the coast of Mexico, made its way through Texas, and then eventually up to Maine. And then they did intersect down in the hill country. But of course, since they were 6 months apart, it wasn't at the same time. These two occurred, but if you note, they didn't occur exactly 6 months apart. One was on October the 14th, the other April the 8th. So close to 6 months, but not exactly. So there's a reason for that. And it's kind of interesting, so I'm going to spend here a second on it. But this diagram kind of shows it that there is a wobble in the moon's orbit around the Earth. So if you want to think of this visually, think of a top that you spin, and just at the moment where the top begins to lose its energy, it hasn't toppled over yet, but just at the very point where it begins to start the process of toppling over, the top of that top will kind of begin to kind of rotate around a little bit and wobble. That's what we're looking at. Now, it's very slow compared to that. I mean, we're looking at a wobble that takes over 18 years. So it's not something that you can observe in a shorter time frame. But every time that this wobble kind of occurs, and as it's moving through this, it's slightly adjusting the point of where these nodes occur. And so as a result, the node, that eclipse season that we saw earlier, actually shifts through the calendar. This is why we can have eclipses in December or August or any other month of the year. They're not always in April and October as they were recently. They can be at any given point in time. So this was actually been observed. So this is a little of an interesting story here. So this picture was taken in the 1950s, and when the photograph was taken, the kind of, I guess you would call them ruins, as it were, the remains of a Puebloan culture structure are seen in the front. This actually happens to be what they refer to as a kiva, or at least what we interpret in English as a kiva. That circular kind of zone there, and it's a ceremonial structure. What is interesting about this particular location, referred to as Chimney Rock National Monument in Colorado, is on a very high point. So these rocks all had to be hauled up the hill in order to make this structure. It was a massive effort. And it was very puzzling to archaeologists as to why this was done this way. So in the 1950s, this particular tower that is in the background, this was a modern built structure. Obviously, it was not something that the Native Americans constructed. That was built to observe forest fires. And it wasn't until after that construction that the realization of why this was here was figured out by observers, in this case, people that were looking at the moon specifically. So if you look at the wood that is used in the construction of the kiva, they were able to date that with carbon dating, and then dendrochronology, they were able to look at the tree rings and figure out that structure was actually built in the year 1093, or at least completed in 1093. Now that's not a random year. As it turns out, as you look from that location where that kiva is, at the two rocks in the distance, when the moon is at one of the extremes of that wobble, so that wobble causes the moon's orbit to kind of shift north and south. And at the point where it was shifted to the far southern extreme, it comes up right between those two rocks. And this is why they built the kiva there, because in 1093, the moon was at its extreme standstill. This has actually been true in many different Native American structures. This alignment with the moon and its particular orbits is observed. We've seen it, and we know that they were tracking it, although it's not quite sure why, because it's not nearly as practical as tracking the sun's orbit, because you can game plan around planting and harvesting, and the agricultural year drives around the sun's orbit. But the moon, it's not nearly so readily apparent as to why they cared so much, but we know that they did because here they built a kiva. As it turns out, the Babylonians cared too. So they would observe this, and because of the fact that their language was typically recorded on clay tablets, and the clay tablets survive to the modern day, we have well in the 1/200,000 of these tablets, and many of them also have other languages like Greek. So we were able to piece together this particular language, which became known as cuneiform. So from that, we know, looking at this particular tablet, that they were observing lunar eclipses and recording them. This is everything from 609 to 447 BC. From that, they defined a cycle of 18 years, 11 days, and 8 hours, and as it turns out, that almost is a to-the-minute precise cycle of a given solar eclipse as well as lunar eclipse. So they got to the point where they could predict when these lunar eclipses would occur. Now, the reason they cared so much is that when a lunar eclipse occurred, it was I don't know if you call it a religious belief, but it was seen as a bad omen for the king. So he actually got into the habit of predicting when the lunar eclipses would occur. Find someone to go in and take over the kingship, as it were, temporarily for the period of the lunar eclipse, so that the king that they had, their primary king, was then saved, kind of like a bodyguard type thing, tasting the food before the king did. However, if that person didn't die, that was actually a problem too, because then we began to question, in this case the Babylonians began to question the predictions of the fact that lunar eclipses were bad for the king. And so they actually killed the interim king in order to preserve the fact that they knew what they were doing. So a little bit of an unusual story there in terms of how this works. So if you look at this Saros cycle in today's terms, you can see that these eclipses occur in patterns. So this particular eclipse, this sequence of the pattern, a given pattern occurs over about 1,262 years, and during that you will see several partials, several annular, but 44 total eclipses. And this sequence of this particular Saros, labeled number 136, started in 1901, that we're looking at, and will end in 2045. So this is kind of the central meat of this particular eclipse pattern. And you can see that every one of these has a very similar looking pattern. Now, the reason that they slide from east to west is that that's about the amount of rotation you get in the Earth in 8 hours. And the reason that they slide from south to north is that the tilt of the Earth is different during these different seasons. You can see it starts in mid-May and ends there in mid-August. So in mid-August, the northern hemisphere is turned more towards the sun. And so that's why that pattern is there. This particular Saros is of interest because it will be our next total solar eclipse. That's 2027, August the 2nd. And as that goes through Egypt, it will go through some interesting places. One particular place called Luxor, which is a very cool place in terms of Egyptian buildings and relics, and it's a very common place to travel to. The problem is people don't go there in August because the predicted high on that day is probably about 145 degrees Fahrenheit. So wouldn't necessarily recommend that location if you want to travel to see this. I would go up on the Mediterranean somewhere there, maybe in Morocco. But this particular eclipse will occur then, and then this same Saros, so we're talking about 18 years later, will then occur in the United States. So this will be the next great American eclipse in 2045 on August the 12th. And that will start off the West Coast, work its way all the way across the middle of the country. It will not come through Texas, but it will go through Oklahoma and then eventually find its way down through Florida. So given the fact that it's August the 12th, particularly if you're here then and are observing it, if you can find your way to the western end of the country, you can probably be more assured of low cloud cover. So this particular one, I thought it interesting to see that these patterns occur so repeatedly. So this was something I'm going to just spend a second on. It didn't actually occur to me when the last eclipse occurred that anyone would think to do this. But I did see it on a YouTube actually after the eclipse occurred and thought, oh, this is actually a pretty good thing for people to know. So if you're looking at the eclipse with just your bare eyes, you don't have a telescope or a camera or binoculars or anything, then this really doesn't apply to you. You just have eclipse glasses. When the sun is not completely covered, you take them off, observe, and then put them back on and observe. But if you are using a telescope, what you do not want to do is to point the telescope at the sun and then put the eclipse glasses over your eyes, which is kind of shown there on the bottom. That concentration of energy from the telescope will burn through those glasses in about 20 seconds. And so you will have no protection at that point, and it's obviously very unsafe. What you need to do is actually put a filter over the end of the telescope, and this would apply to a camera or binoculars or whatever. So just a safety point if you do ever find yourself chasing an eclipse. So as those of you who were here that day kind of remember, it was not completely clear day. There were a lot of clouds. The two pictures here were taken from where Mary and I were observing the eclipse, which was at River Legacy Park here in town. As you can kind of see, Mary's there with her eclipse glasses. This was actually not too long prior to the total eclipse, but she's observing a partial at that moment. And you can kind of see the camera set up, and that silver portion there at the end of it in the photograph at the left, that was our solar filter. So again, like I just described, you want that on the end of your camera. As it turns out, we didn't know that day, but we did find out later that the actual point where the moon begins to cover the sun cools the atmosphere right where you're observing it. And so there is a effect where that cooling air temperature will tend to kind of push the clouds away. So that's why, despite the fact that there were so many clouds that day, a lot of people reported being able to observe the eclipse. And while you were certainly lucky for that to happen for you, and I hope it did for everyone that's looking at this, I hope you got to see it. That wasn't pure luck. There was actually a little bit of physics there that kind of helped you out. So here's an image. This was one of the first images that we took. As you can see, there is a kind of a bright portion there at the top of the picture, and that was taken just as the sun is disappearing behind the moon. You can take the solar filter off of your camera for about 20 to 25 seconds prior to the complete eclipse and begin to take pictures then, and your camera will not be damaged by that. So that's what we did, and this picture was actually immediately prior. So this is a good place to stop and talk through some of our terminology. That's the corona, the portion of the, I guess you would call it the sun's atmosphere that kind of extends out. The bright portion there, they kind of refer that to the diamond ring. So the idea is it doesn't quite look that way on this photograph because it's a little stronger exposed. But if you expose it a little bit less, you kind of still have that diamond effect, and then you still get a little bit of the corona showing around the rest of the moon, and the entire effect looks a little bit like a diamond ring. Now the red portion that kind of is standing around that, that's actually a camera effect. I have a photograph here where I took that out just for aesthetics to kind of change it a little bit. In this case, the anomalies that you see along the portion right at where the black fades into the Earth's atmosphere, that is actually the bumps and mountains and craters of the moon. The moon, if it were perfectly round, you would not see these. But right at that point where you can see the sun's energy kind of creeping through there, it can create a little bit of a bright spot, not as bright as the diamond ring, but slightly bright, and those are referred to as Bailey's beads. In this particular photograph, you can just kind of barely see one. And you can't see it real well on this. We do have some photographs here we'll look at a second where you can see it much more of a solar prominence. So these are effects that at the time I kept calling them solar flares. I looked online and saw myself corrected that prominence is the actual correct scientific term, because they may be flares or they may be other features, and so prominence is a more generic term. So every corona has its own kind of personality. The one on the left here is taken in 2024. The one on the right is taken in 2017. So we were fortunate enough to be able to observe that one as well. We went to Idaho, Mary and I, and we took her 89-year-old father. And he had never seen a total solar eclipse. So bravo to her for thinking of this and game planning it and pulling it together. I actually aesthetically kind of like the 2017 corona a little bit better than the 2024. Although the 2024 has some nice features as well, as we kind of look for it here in a second. But when you see eclipses, if you see this pattern, in the case of the one on the right, Mary kind of labeled that a fox face, where the two sort of pointy features that go to the top kind of look like the ears, and the one that goes down to the bottom being the snout of the fox. So, use your imagination there. But they all kind of have patterns that are very similar, and when you see them, you'll recognize the eclipse photos at once as to where it came from. So this is that same photograph that we looked at a second ago. I just kind of colorized it a bit to where the red flare of the lens was taken out. So this is almost completely. So it looks a little bit more like you might have been able to see it with your bare eyes, although, again, keeping in mind that you can't really see the diamond ring effect with your eyes. You have to be looking and capturing it through a camera. You won't see this individual effect. This image, though, you can see. So this is now during totality. And one of the aspects of this is that the exposure is less. So this is not really a factor of what the sun is doing. This is a factor of what I was doing with the camera. So I decreased the exposure, which made the corona less visible, but made the chromosphere features, the prominences, a little bit more visible. So you can see three of them kind of on the upper half and then sort of on the right hand side. So we have a few here that we'll see a little bit better in a second. So this particular photograph is one that was very indicative of what people were experiencing at the very end of the eclipse, at least here in Texas. So if you kind of notice, we have our effect here with the diamond ring as the sun is appearing, just kind of off in this case to the right hand side. The exposure on this is much lower now because it's getting bright because the sun is just coming out, and the camera naturally reduced the exposure. So that took off the vast majority of the corona, but now the prominences were much more visible. And a lot of people commented being able to see the one, particularly the one on the bottom, that kind of triangular looking point of that particular prominence. That was mentioned multiple times on news coverage after. This particular diagram, or photograph rather, is just a little earlier, and again the exposure was brought down considerably to enhance the chromosphere and decrease the impact of the corona. So you see very little corona, but you can now see prominences coming off of the sun. And we'll actually talk about this in a second. Every eclipse is not going to have these prominences, and we'll kind of talk about why there were so many in the 2024 particular image. So exposure, I kind of mentioned this a couple times. If you ever want to get into photographing eclipses, this is something to keep in your head. This is actually the same photograph. What happens is, in the camera that I was using, it had an ability is every time that you snapped a picture, it would actually set the exposure to several different layers. Actually, in this camera's case, 9. Some have 7, some have 5. Depends on the camera you have. But what you see is a lot of various different settings there. And in this case, the lower right hand side is overexposed, and the other 3 might be kind of usable depending on what you were kind of looking for. So if you're trying to emphasize the corona, you need a little bit more exposure. If you're looking for other features, then you might use a little less exposure. But by setting your camera to where it takes a whole range of exposures at the same time, then you can basically have your choice. So a little bit about those prominences. The image on the left is a close-up view of my photograph, so you can just barely see the diamond ring effect coming up in the upper right. You can see a little bit of Bailey's beads right next to that, but down toward the bottom of the sun, you can see the 2 prominences there that are very noticeable. And one of them, you can see it close enough that you can see a little bit of red and then a little bit of white in the middle of it. And that's actually true colors that you see in the visual spectrum. Hydrogen, when it gets heated to certain levels, actually looks red to us. This is something we don't ever see on Earth. You actually have to be observing it coming off the sun. And so a total eclipse is the only time that we, people on Earth, can see this without special filters. Now on the right hand side, this is not my photograph, this is NASA, and they have a extremely expensive telescope camera. Who knows, could be millions of dollars to get that image, but they are looking at only a very small range of the UV scale to get that, and so they're able to photograph the sun. You can see these all over the internet if you go look. After the last eclipse, it became a lot of these got put out there of people that have photographed this, particularly NASA too. The Earth, just to provide you an approximate size here of how big these features are, is about that size. So it's a tiny little feature compared to the prominence. So the prominence that we were seeing coming off the sun was much larger than the Earth. Another factor I wanted to kind of comment on in terms of observing or photographing eclipses is that the clouds that we were kind of complaining about the whole time because we were worried they were going to mess up the moment of totality are actually a beneficial feature when you're looking at a partial eclipse or an annular eclipse or anything that isn't the moment of a total eclipse, because those clouds actually make for a much more interesting photograph. Here you can see a lot of the haziness in the sun is that cloud. That one dot, I think you can kind of see it. Let's get this right here. That dot is actually a sunspot. So again, if you want to observe sunspots with a camera and a filter, you can do that any day of the week. Well, any day of the week that you can see the sun. So that's not something you have to wait for an eclipse to see. And in fact, this is a photograph earlier before we had the total eclipse phases, and you can see what probably looked like maybe just a spot on the lens when you're looking at the picture from a distance. Those were actually those prominences, but you can see them kind of head on, and that's what the sunspots are. So this is a chart that shows that these sunspots and the prominences and the ejections from the sun kind of go through a cycle. And our last minimal cycle was probably 2018 to 2020. So that 2017 eclipse, we were on a downswing getting near the bottom of the quantity of prominences. This last eclipse, we were actually near the top. The top was predicted to be July of 2025. I think scientists think it may be peaking earlier. It wasn't quite at peak in April of 2024, but it was higher than this particular chart, which is showing December of 2022. It was higher than that, probably higher than the peak that was shown there. So that's why we saw so many prominences in the photographs, which, keep in mind, the photographs that we were looking at were only taken over a, 2.5 minute time period. So to be able to see that many prominences in that short amount of time just indicated how active the sun is. Another factor of this is that the northern lights that you see, this is why that's been so much in the news since the time frame of the eclipse, is that when that same solar energy hits the earth, it ends up getting kind of deflected up to the poles and coming down into the atmosphere and reacting with the oxygen content to create the crazy colors, the greens, the various blues, even reds. Those all are solar energy that is stimulating the chemicals in the atmosphere. So that's why we see that. So a couple of little extra credits if you've stuck with me up to this point. Lunar eclipse, we can talk that just for a second, is the exact same kind of geometry. They happen during the same eclipse seasons as the total solar eclipse. But in this case, the Earth is getting in between the moon and the sun. So again, obviously our scales here are all completely off, but it does show that there is an umbra and a penumbra. And in this case, the shadows are also created. But the difference is that instead of a tiny shadow from the Earth's perspective, the moon, when it's at eclipse, can be visualized potentially for hours. And not only is it visible for long periods of time, it's visible from a huge percentage of the Earth, kind of as you go forward. So this is a blood moon. This is what you actually see during the lunar eclipse. And the reason you see that is that the full spectrum sunlight is coming through the atmosphere. It kind of gets bent, a little bit like a prism. And as the light goes through the atmosphere, the blue end of the spectrum tends to get scattered and the red penetrates. And so that's why generally the light from the sun that's getting through the Earth's atmosphere, bending towards the moon and then reflecting back down to the Earth, tends to be a reddish color. That's why you see that. Here's a couple of images. This is a partial eclipse over on the left-hand side and a partial phase of the moon on the right-hand side. So on the right-hand side, the partial phases have nothing to do with shadows from the Earth. Those are actually created in the same way that this photograph of the model is on the right-hand side, where the lighting is from one side and not the other. And that's exactly what's happening with the moon, is that the sun's lighting is on one side of it and not the other. That's why you get the partial